A good life is a life built around fulfilling work, play, relationships, and lifelong learning. Welcome to Good Life Conversations, where we explore the stories and strategies of inspiring everyday people who are striving to create a life of purpose, meaning, and connection. Hello, and welcome to this Good Life Conversation. I'm Jay, your host and the founder of Discover Year, and today's guest is Scott Robertson. Welcome, Scott.
Jay, thanks for having me.
So Scott is currently a senior associate at the law firm of Nahwegahbow. Help me.
Nahwegahbow.
Nahwegahbow Corbiere. It's an Indigenous law firm. So Scott has been practicing Indigenous law here in Canada for a number of years. Interestingly, he did not start out learning or studying or practicing law after he graduated from high school. He took his own gap year, traveled around Australia, which he can tell you a little bit about. He came back, he got a degree in geography and also thereafter a degree as a teacher. And so he's done a lot of interesting things in his life. And at some point, quite a few years after he studied at the undergraduate level, decided to go back to school and become a lawyer and has focused his efforts in law on Indigenous law since then. So, thanks for being here, Scott. And I'd love to unpack a bunch of those things that we just mentioned, but let's start with your day in the life. So we like to hear from each of our mentors. What does a day look like? What time do you get up? Do you have any morning routines? What kind of work do you do? How long does that take you in a day? How do you wind down the day? What time do you go to bed?
Okay. Typical day, I wake up around 6 a.m. every day. And I purposely start my day, the first hour. Um, I call it the sun salutation if you're a yoga freak. What I do is not yoga so much, but personal reflection. So I think about some of the things that I did the day before. I think about some of the things that I'm going to try to accomplish today. Usually involves some form of exercise, running, jogging, whatever. And then focusing on, what it is that I'm here to do in a certain time period, I guess. So whether it be the month, the week, the year, and just focusing on what I can do today. So then that starts my day. After breakfast, then you sit down, and it depends. Like I was just telling Jay before, this is not your typical job. I do a lot of travel across Canada. So I find myself waking up in a lot of different places. So orienting yourself, timetables with respect to being a lawyer are quite constrained. You're either in court or maybe a mediation or an arbitration. So the day is somewhat structured when I'm doing the actual advocacy work. So that limits you in terms of what you can do during the day. You're usually, if you're advocating, that's what you're doing. If I'm at home when I'm working, it's generally with respect to writing and preparing for court and whatnot. So you're doing a lot of research, those kinds of things. So during the course of the day, that's how I would structure my day at home. But balancing, right? So I don't want to end up at the end of 12 hours sitting in my chair all day. So throughout the day, I do different tasks at different times. So I'm a morning person. I think better in the morning, logically, abstractly. Both of those take better, forms in the morning. So when I get into the afternoon, it becomes more administrative. So reaching out to new clients, doing the stuff like calculating your hours and your billings and all those kinds of things. The other part of being a lawyer, the less romantic part, I would say, that takes place in the afternoon. And in the evenings, I reserve my evenings mostly for family. So spending time with my wife and children and grandchildren and all that kind of stuff. And also, again, detaching yourself from work. So if I have a book to read or something to work on that's not work related, I usually do that in the evenings, which calms you down, separates you and detaches you from the next work day, so to speak. So that's kind of how I structure my day.
hmm And you go to bed just so we get a sense of how many hours you sleep. What time do you typically go to bed?
Yeah. Bed, usually by 10 a.m. or say 10 p.m. And so I may be reading by 10 p.m. and it might continue on depending on the book, depending on how you feel, but I'm generally asleep by about 10:30. So that's 7.5 hours of sleep,
Okay. And that
which
seems to
works
be
for
good.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of a sweet spot for me. More get up, I'm a little more sore physically. If I find if I sleep too long, my body just like seizes up. But also, I find if I sleep too much, I end up getting groggy. I'm not as sharp in the morning as if I had just had like 7.5 hours. So I know it seems, and of course, this isn't included for young people with young kids and stuff like that. That's a whole different, it's a whole different ball of wax.
Okay, that's great. So this, I'd love to ask about the 1 hour kind of period of reflection in the morning that you do. Is that a new practice? How long have you been doing that?
For the last 5 years. And I remember, I can tell you exactly when it started. I was at a conference in Vancouver and I went down to get breakfast. I was staying at a hotel and I had heard the day before one of the opening speakers was an elder, was a Coast Salish elder. And he was sitting by himself in the corner of like the hotel restaurant or whatever. And so I just walked over and I said, do you mind if I share breakfast with you? And he said, sure, no problem. And so he asked me what I would do normally in the morning. And I thought it was a weird question. I said, I'm going to get up, eat breakfast, read the newspaper. And so he was listening intently. And then I asked, well, what do you do? And he started telling me about his routine of like this self-reflection. And I never thought about it before. Like I just, since the time I can remember as a kid, I just woke up and lived my life. And this is what I had to do. And I had to go to the grocery store, go to school or whatever without any kind of conscious, thought about, well, what was I trying to accomplish in that day? And not just like paint the fence type of accomplishment, but from a personal perspective of growth. And what have I learned the day before that I can apply to today is what he's basically telling me in his own kind and wise words. And from that day forward, it's been that's what I do. I wake up and I just spend some time reflecting and projecting, I suppose, as to what you're going to be doing, but also reflecting on what I've done.
Mm.
And I find it very grounding in a sense of not feeling rushed. And I have to like jump into the day and try to hang on for the ride, but feeling much more like I'm in control and that this is what I've decided to do today.
Mm.
And it works. It really
Yeah. So,
works.
so you feel, would you see, you feel better? How do you feel better?
I feel better prepared. And again, I feel like I have some control over what I'm going to do today. Because a lot of times, especially in law, I find people that I talk to always kind of complain or have a concern about the fact that the practice leads them, right? They're always trying to catch up and jump on and where do I go next type of thing. Which, if that's your feeling and that's the like you have no control over a situation, can be very stressful.
Mm. That's great. Great advice. And as is often the case, our mentors, Scott, as you might be able to guess, is not 21. He's a few years older. And this is a practice that he began 5 years ago. So again, like most of our other mentors, it's a work in progress. We can always be learning and adapting to kind of live a better life. So I'd love to know, Scott. I read in your bio you have a number of hobbies that I connect with: kayaking, golf, hockey, snowboarding. So you're a pretty active person. Gardening, reading. I would love to. In your bio, you mentioned that golf has been a gateway for you to have a lot of new experiences. So when we talk about hobbies a lot in the program, because our students are quite interested in what our mentors do outside of their work. So tell us a little bit about how you got started in golf and why it's been so valuable for you.
Started with golf, I guess, easy came from my grandfather, who's Scottish, um, and easy, adaptable. I mean, and what he always stressed as an older person when he was teaching me how to golf was that, you play hockey and you do all these things now, but you're going to get to a point in your life where it's going to be very difficult to play those sports. So adopting and learning how to play golf and the etiquette of golf is important because he says you'll be able to play this late into your, when you get older. And I didn't think anything about that when you're a child or a kid growing up. You're just like, well, it's fun to play golf. But as you get older, it is truly it's an interesting sport that you can play anywhere, anytime in the world. You can show up at a golf course, they'll put you into a foursome, and then all of a sudden you're spending 18 holes, which is 4 hours with complete strangers. By the end of those 4 hours, you've got three new friends, sharing their experiences, where they're from, because you have this common, intention of golfing, which I find fascinating. So it is a sport in essence, and it's an Olympic sport now. It's more than that. To me, it's a touch point in terms of being able to break down barriers. People feel comfortable, and they just know you're standing on a tee box with three other individuals who are like-minded. It just kind of makes it easier to meet people. So it's transportable. Um, some people will call golf elitist, but that's not how it got its roots. It was much more simple and plain. But you can play it all over the world, and then you meet people that want to travel play golf. So it becomes something to, go somewhere and do something. It provides that kind of impetus. So it's kind of an interesting sport slash hobby, but it's also very much about forming relationships. And some of the complete strangers that I've met around the world golfing have become friends. They've
Mm.
become business contacts. It's led to other opportunities, all from places that I never would have met people or had any opportunity to speak to them. And so another nice part about when we go on a golf holiday trip, um, you because you're meeting people that most oftentimes are local, which I find if you go to a country and you're staying in resorts and stuff, you never actually meet people that live in the country. But on a golf trip, you do. And you'll interact and you'll get more advice and experiences and meet more people. And I find that much more like lively and engaging than just, so I just use golf, but you can insert any kind of sport, tennis or other pursuits, say skiing. You could also do that skiing and pick up and meet people and on places and hills and places around the world that you'd never be able to do that normally. So just insert golf with whatever pursuit and hobby you like to
Mm.
take part in.
I'm a big golfer too, as you know, and this is so interesting to me because I never thought about it this way, but it's similar to a lot of the conversations we have at Discover Year where you're going to be matched with a group of people conceivably who have at least one thing in common with you, but more than likely they probably have many things that are very different from you, many more things that are different from you. So it's this commonality that you can, as you mentioned, look for in other parts of your life where you're striving to like be able to connect quickly with people, but it's great when those environments include people who are going to be very different in so many different ways as well. And people perhaps have a stereotypical idea of who a golfer is out in the world, and I've learned myself that that's often not the case. The elitist, especially in today's world, golf is more accessible. So that's really cool. Thank you for helping me think about it that way. Um, I would love to know too, just on this topic of kind of connecting with people, forming relationships. One of the questions we like to ask is there an important lesson that you've learned about relationships? And if so, what is it?
So, as Jay knows, I get to work 100% of my time working with First Nations and Indigenous people from across Canada. And I would say one of the most important words in the Indigenous communities and people that I've worked with is relationships. And you have to remember, Indigenous people, prior to European contact, relationships would have been key to survival, right? You didn't have a lot of things that we take for granted now. And so relationships become people that you rely upon when you don't have enough food or there's some kind of, you know, counterforce or interactions with other indigenous communities that aren't so nice. You have to rely upon these relationships. So the word relationship itself is embedded in their languages. It often comes up and it may even be what we refer to them as people is really a word that's centered on relationship. So knowing that and feeling that and experiencing that as you get older, you realize that one of the most important things in your life are relationships. And what you also realize is that relationships are difficult and they're not convenient, the ones that are worth being in anyway. And so you learn to foster relationships, things that you take for granted when you're a kid or an adult, a young adult, you don't take for granted as you get older because you start to lose some of your relationships. First of all, people pass away and people move away and those kinds of things. And you yearn for some of those people that you used to be friends with, but you kind of lost touch with. And so relationships to me are almost like a currency, currency in a sense of they're valuable. They have a value, they have a worth that you can't actually put your finger on and say is worth this much, not from a dollar value, but from a feeling value. Like how much do you feel better or supported or like-minded or whatever it is with the relationships that you have. And some of them you take for granted, like, your spouse or your kids or whatever, that's a relationship that's bonded. And I'm not talking about those relationships. They can't be taken for granted. But I'm talking about the circular relationships outside of that tight ring. You've got friends from school or friends from work or friends from your past. And those relationships are really important. And why people ask, well, why are relationships so important? They keep you, I find my own personal experiences keep me grounded and remind you where you came from, right? So that the people that you grew up with knew you when you weren't a lawyer or a doctor or whatever. And they can share stories with you and experiences and fears and things that you used to worry about when you were kids or adults or young adults or teenagers or whatever. And I think that's extremely important to know where you came from and those relationships that you fostered along the way. It also is important in terms of developing your character to know that you have friends and colleagues that you can rely upon or share things that are meaningful. And so that all happens through the conduit of relations and not relations that you're going to rely upon to better yourself, but relations just to know who you are and to know where your place is.
I really this aspect of, the best relationships are often not convenient is something that really jumps out at me as being perhaps different in many ways today. There's much more convenience in our world. So for young people listening to this, they can't really even imagine a time where they didn't have their own personal phone, as an example, being able to access to, thousands or hundreds of thousands, millions of people. So I think that's really a worthwhile thing to reinforce here that the most important, meaningful relationships take effort. And that's something that other mentors have shared as well.
And to that, I would say everybody has their own way of connecting, whether it be through social media or whatnot. But that's not how I connect. Me, it's actually physically spending time with people and a time, that's relaxed. One of those things where you show up and 30 minutes becomes 3 hours
Hmm.
because you've got a lot to talk about and things to share. And there's just things that you can talk about in person that you can't possibly express over an electronic medium. So I mean that's individual, right? Like that's up to everybody else. But I think in my own personal meaningful relationships, it's being able to spend some quality time with the people that are what I would say important. I don't know if that's the right word or meaningful. I don't know.
Yeah, that's great. I think the important message is that it's important to try various methods to build relationships, and young people just often haven't been given a lot of opportunities to build those in-person relationships the way people formerly did. They have other outlets, but I would love to hear more about. So we only have so much time in these podcasts, and I didn't mention this at the outset, but when I met Scott, he educated me for a few minutes. It was at a party, it was a social event, but when I asked him what he did, and he explained to me that he was an Indigenous rights lawyer, I was very curious about that. And then Scott went on to tell me in in no uncertain terms that as Canadians, we should not be as proud as we might think of ourselves as a country. And so that all ties into Scott's mission, in Indigenous law. And so, Scott, I'd love for you to, if you don't mind, telling us, you graduated from university, you became a teacher, and then all of a sudden you were working at the University of Ottawa at the time. And then all of a sudden you decided to go back to law school. Can you tell us about what was the impetus there? What made you understand that this was really important to you, and why did you take that track into Indigenous law?
So I come at it from two perspectives. One, my mom is Indigenous, so she's from Six Nations of the Grand River. So I knew about her past. But two, when I was teaching, I worked at the University of Ottawa and I was teaching a class in the education faculty before I went to the co-op office. And at that juncture, I ended up working with a First Nation, Kitigan, which is not far from Ottawa. And we were doing some curriculum development for them. And in doing so, this issue of funding came up where the school was very keen, this is a few years back, on incorporating some of their Indigenous language into the curriculum in terms of what they were teaching so that kids would find it more meaningful. And all the studies suggest that it's better if you do that and you get better outcomes, learning outcomes and whatnot. But what I found out is that the province of Quebec at the time was not interested in funding that. So I went to some meetings and we had some conversations with ministry representatives trying to explain why this would be a good thing. And it wasn't resonating. Like nobody wanted to listen to a teacher. But I did notice that there was a lawyer in the room who was making arguments that people thought were quite profound. And I said to myself, well, if you're going to be in these meetings and you want to make a difference, you can be the teacher and you can make your lesson plan, or you can be the lawyer and you can advocate. And so that planted the seed in the sense of I wanted to feel like what I was doing was valuable. And especially to First Nation communities that didn't seem to have a lot of capacity at the time or were subjected to regulations and other ulterior motives from governments that they had no control over. And that to me, that just looked like a power imbalance that needed to be addressed. I'm not suggesting for a second that I have had any of that influence in doing what I'm doing, but it just felt like something needed to be done. And I just felt like I could make a bigger difference advocating for education for First Nations people than actually being a teacher. Not to say that teachers don't have a massive influence, they do. And everybody in your program could probably list three or four teachers that have helped them immensely in their lives and taught them how to be a better person and learn and all those kinds of things, which are extremely important. But just in a sense of where I was at, the crossroads of my career, so to speak, I just felt like I could make a bigger impact.
Hmm. And then so you decided at some point to go to law school and focus all of your efforts from that time forward on Indigenous law.
And it's been very rewarding. It's, it's not something that a lot of people will do. It's not for the faint of heart. Some people like to take roller coasters. I like to change career. So it was, it's not easy to convince your wife of so many years that you're going to quit your job and go back to school with, no prospects basically, and you're going to start over again. But it's not just me making the decision again, right? Again, to talk about relationships, that's something that requires a lot of thought and effort and trust from you and your family as well, because my family as a whole, even our kids can tell you that we all made a sacrifice so I could go back to school
Hmm.
and pursue what I wanted to pursue. But by doing so, it's taught everybody in our family some lifelong lessons about what they want to do and where they want to focus. And then even my wife went back to school and got a master's in education afterwards. So clearly had some influence on her as well.
So if if a young person is listening here, they think, okay, teacher, lawyer, most people probably wouldn't have at that age anyways, a really deep understanding of the kind of skills or talents that are required to do one profession or the other in a broad sense. But I would assume from the outside, I've never done either of those professions specifically, but it doesn't seem like it's exactly the same skill set. And what I'm honing in on here is you kind of did you think, oh, can I be a good lawyer? Like, was there any process for you to determine was this something that was well suited for you, or was it just a change needs to happen, I can make it happen?
Boy, I always approached the practice of law like I didn't have any experience. There's no lawyers in my family. Nobody in my family actually went to university before I did. So it was like all of this is new. I didn't have any mentors, so to speak, in a sense of what I was doing. But to me, the law is an application of storytelling. You appear before a judge, and you're essentially giving the judge a lesson in terms of whatever it is that your case is about what the law that applies to your case, about how it would be good for the judge to make a decision in your favor because. So that to me was like lesson planning, right? You're just getting your facts, setting them out in a sequence that at the end of the term or the end of the case, the judge has a very comprehensive view of what your opinions and your ideas are and compares that with someone else. So they're telling their story and they're presenting their lecture. And so to me, it was very transferable skills. Like you're at the front of a class, you're at the front of a court. Um, you're prepared in terms of what it is you're going to speak to. You're trying to address the audience, which as a teacher is your class, as a lawyer is the judge, who is the trier. And I mean, essentially, what you're trying to do is make everybody better, just like a school teacher would, right? You're just trying to help them and not so much teach the lesson, but teach them how to learn. And so for me, I never thought it was that much different, and I still approach that in the basic tenets of providing a lecture to or presenting a case. That's kind of the roadmap that I follow, and I never thought it was any different from one to the other. So, I mean, the writing part of it, sure, there's some the advocacy part. There's a structure to it in terms of how you approach witnesses and those kinds of things, which is something that you have to learn in terms of that advocacy skill. But the tenets, the essential tenets of what you're doing are very similar.
That's really interesting. I enjoy hearing that perspective because I wouldn't have ever thought to explain it that way or think of it that way. I'd love to know. There's many questions I would love to ask you. There are many, but I would love to know because you have such a broad base of understanding of Indigenous history and law in Canada. For anyone listening, what's something that you think the general Canadian public does not know, but perhaps should know about Indigenous law or, First Nations, Indigenous people in Canada?
All right. I can tell you one of the most eye-opening, I guess, pieces of history that I've learned as a lawyer. So when I get asked to speak at, meetings where lawyers are attending at a conference or whatnot, I often have a conversation about lawyers being agents of harm. And people always stop and like, what are you talking about? We advocate for people. That's not true. And I said, well, you have to know Canadian history to understand what I'm saying. So there was a 27-year period in Canadian history where it was against the law for a lawyer in Canada to represent a First Nation on a First Nation claim. And I found that when I found that out, I was absolutely shocked. And so I said, well, that there must have been some resistance to that. Like we're talking about like 1934 to I think 1953 or whatever it was, is 27 years. I mean, that's not relatively that long ago. And surely, the League of Nations has been started and the world had a certain lens or whatever. But if you look at any of the law societies in Canada, the Law Society or the organizations within the provinces that regulate lawyers, there wasn't a single complaint brought by any lawyer in Canada to that law over the course of 27 years. Nobody, as a lawyer, thought it was offensive that there was a law that prevented them from advocating for a group of people in Canada. Now,
Mm,
as a lawyer, I find that absolutely shocking because that's what we're trained to prevent.
right.
We're trained to prevent those kinds of things where rights are taken away from people, specifically the right to go seek legal counsel. I mean, that starts to sound like a different part of the world.
Mm,
And so I found that really disheartening. And then I also found out with respect to residential schools, because we talked about it, when I did some research, the mastermind of residential schools in Canada, who drafted a report to the Privy Council that was adopted by Sir John A. Macdonald, was a lawyer practicing in Saskatchewan. So again, an agent of harm who had the ability to advocate for First Nations chose to not advocate, but actually, I would say, do immense harm to hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people, all from the policy that was drafted by a lawyer and adopted by the Prime Minister. So
That is
those,
shocking.
it is shocking. I mean, to be in this profession and take the oath that we take, right, to represent everybody, even if it's someone who's been alleged of the crime, everybody gets an equal defense. It's shocking to think that that's what's been going on in this country.
Hmm.
That would be, and that's only from the legal lens. That's
Yeah.
it's not a personal lens, or I'm sure there's lots of other things we could talk about.
Yeah, and perhaps some of those will be, questions from our students. They might be able to ask you or be interested in asking you about some other things you've learned or what they can do to support Indigenous peoples in Canada. Um, okay, thank you. Yeah, I think there's just so much that we could possibly explore there. We don't have time for it all today, but I appreciate you sharing that. And I would love to, okay, one question that that doesn't fit in anywhere here, but that I think is so interesting and our students will enjoy hearing about is you, after you went to law school, well, at some point in your younger days, you created a board game, as far as I recall you telling it. And I like this story because it highlights what is actually sometimes of use or important in job search criteria. So the backstory, as I understand it, is Scott at some point decided to create a board game of some kind. He can tell you what it was and a bit about it. But he created this board game and he added that on his resume. And he was interviewing at law firms, which most people would think a law firm, you're wearing a three-piece suit, everyone's dead serious and they're focused on the law and who's the smartest person, we want to hire them. And as Scott told me previously, every interview he had, one of the questions that he got was about this board game because he wrote on his resume that he had made a board game. So can you tell us a little bit about the game and how that helped you in this interview process?
And that's a really good point, Jay. I often sometimes forget that story, but yeah. So I mean, when you're in school and you're in university and you're whatever profession you're gonna, it's sometimes you get lost in the minutia of what it is that makes you a person, right? And grades, don't get me wrong, are important, and experiences are very important too. But oftentimes interviewers, and I've done a fair amount of interviews now, as my career has progressed, interviewing law students that want to get jobs at our firm and stuff. And it's really easy to get, swayed into what is it that makes a good lawyer or whatever. And it's usually the conversation centers around, well, what did you get in this course? And what school did you go to? And what was your undergrad in? What kind of marks did you get? Like that's what people want to ask. But I always find what differentiates candidates is, yeah, I mean, if you're in law school, you're pretty smart anyway, right? So it's not like, you know, A, sub A2 or whatever. It's kind of like learning what also is the person behind the law school. And so I just threw it in because someone had told me along the way, working at the co-op office where I basically met Jay, we'd always look for things in terms of helping students develop a resume. And so we would ask them, personalize it, put something in there that makes you, who you are. So if I look at this, I get a better idea of you just going to engineering school or whatever. So I little legitimately had created a board game. When we were growing up, we used to play board games all the time. And, I always thought that it would be really cool to have a board game where, you would, I called it a boat face. And it was a double entendre because you moved around the board. If you got a question wrong, you had to go backwards. If you got it right, you went forwards. That was the about face. And then there was a card you flipped over in different categories, kind of ripping off on Trivial Pursuit. And you had a picture of a person and you had to know who it was. And it was based on different categories like cartoons and entertainment, sports, and that kind of stuff. It was a wonderful idea. It was a great game. We still play it. Our kids play it. We have like two prototypes that we made. It was wonderful. I went down to a company in Oakville, Ontario. It's called Jackrabbit, Jackrabbit Games. I don't even know if they're still in business, but this guy was a game developer. And so I talked to him on the phone. He said, bring your game down. And so, true to form, he said, "Well, let's play your game." I said, "Oh, really?" He goes, "Yeah, that's how you learn whether it's a good game or not." And this guy would get hundreds, if not thousands, of game applications a year where people would just show, "I got a great idea for a game." And so we played it, and he said, "This is one of the best games I've ever played. It's fantastic." He goes, "But here's your problem." So this is my first legal lesson, basically. I wasn't in law school yet, but I'd already learned a good lesson. He says, "See all those images you had?" And I can't remember. I had maybe like 2,000 images that I'd, taken off the internet or whatever at the time. He says, "Every one of those is as a copyright or a trademark." He says, "You would have to get permission for each of those." And just to give you an idea at the time, he says, "You have a picture of Elvis? That'll probably cost you $500,000 to license." He says, "That blows your game out of the water. Nobody would be able to afford it. It's a great game, but he says you can't use any of those images, and it's not going to work."
Mm,
So it's only my game. It's not gonna get played by anybody else.
mm.
Certainly not produced or whatever. But when I went into the interview, getting to Jay's question, when I went into the interview, that's one of the first things they asked me. "Well, tell me about your game." I'm like, "What?" That's what they had circled and highlighted, and I could see across, like, they're all highlighted the fact that I made a game. And the other thing on my resume too was I was at the time I had a radio spot at the University of Ottawa doing I was DJing my own show on Indigenous issues, Indigenous artists, and stuff like that. And that also got talked a lot about because they hadn't seen that before.
Mm.
So the things that you do outside of whatever profession you're trying to do, don't forget them. Don't minimize them, and make sure you include them because that's who you are. That reflects who you are as a person.
Yeah, I love that. And the caveat that I would add here is that sometimes in today's world, the message becomes, just make something up, put something that's exciting that will draw people's attention. But the message here is, unearth the things that you already have done and are curious about or interested in, and put those there. And that can take hard work. Sometimes it's not top of mind, right? Like, what are the things that are interesting about me? So it takes thought. But it's important that it be obviously genuine. In this case, Scott had made this game and he was DJing the show. That's an important part rather than just making something up to look fun.
Would be detrimental to making something up because if you do get asked questions about it, there may come an opportunity where someone who's interviewing you also has a shared interest, and then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
But if you're making it up, they'll be able to see through the facade.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Scott. We need to wrap up. So I'd like two more questions. One really fast. Our students, as you know, travel in February, and we like to talk about travel sometimes. So what's your favorite place that you've ever traveled to?
Um, so I think the last time I did this, I had talked about Sydney, Australia, which I think is one of the nicest cities in the world. But my favorite place, spiritual, both physical, geography, and just the place has an amazing feeling, is Haida Gwaii, just off the coast of British Columbia. If you ever get a chance, it's pristine. The environment's pristine. The Haida Nation, which is the predominant First Nation group there, just signed an agreement with the federal and provincial governments for Aboriginal territory and management of their resources, which is groundbreaking, which makes me feel good about being, part of what we do, but also it's just an incredible place, like an ecosystem like nowhere else in the world. And it's one of those few places in the world where you actually step your foot on the ground and, I don't know how religious I am, but there's a kind of a spiritual feeling that comes over you that something exciting is happening. And I don't know how to explain that, but it's just a really nice place.
Very cool. Very cool. I hope to go there someday. I mean, the west coast of Canada and BC in general is beautiful, so I can imagine what it could be like.
Bring a
Okay.
kayak.
Thank you. Moon kayak?
Bring a kayak, yeah.
Okay. All right. Last question is, this is called Good Life Conversation, and the point of calling it Good Life Conversation is that, life is not just about the work you do or the games you play or the people you know. It's all those things and much more. So, we were chatting before we started recording a little bit about, some of the more popular or, themes that come out of Indigenous cultures and practices. And you talked about the word good life and what that means, which means not only doing what you can do, but helping others is what I am paraphrasing from that. So, What advice would you have for young people in today's world, which can be very confusing with a lot coming at them? What advice would you have for our audience to create a good life for themselves?
So, the piece of advice that if I could go back and talk to myself when I was 18 or 19, um, having similar experiences, is what you really want to focus on is being yourself. We talked a little bit about that in terms of your interviewing sequence, but what also, like, I mean, it seems simple, right? Being yourself, well, yeah, okay. But being confident in who you are and not trying to be something that you're not, for any reason, whether it be a job or friends or anything else. And so by being yourself, you'll feel comfortable, you'll feel confident in knowing who you are and what you do, and that will project itself. And I mean, it's very hard to explain how that works, but you know it when you see it. Like in the world that I work in, it can be very stressful. There's a lot of, you know, pulls and pushes in terms of the practice of law. But when you come upon and meet people who are grounded and who know who they are and are confident in what they do, it's incredible. It's like a superpower. And I can only think that it was developed at an early age and it gets stronger. It's like a tree with a ring. You got growth rings going on. I find if those people were, trees, they would have immense growth rings.
Hmm.
Whereas you see people who are um, trying to fit themselves into whatever mold they think they should be. And what you get from that looking outwardly is not a lot of substance. And it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, as long as you are accepting of that and own it and lean into that and make it work for you, because it's the individuality that people are going to remember, right? It's the uniqueness of who you are. And I find the simplest stories and the simplest backgrounds make the most complex people. So I don't know if that's equatable in terms of what you're learning now, or where would you get information on that? But it seems simple, but it's not easy.
Yeah, simple but not easy for sure. So be yourself. Bring all the best things that you've done or the interesting things that you've done to the world, and learn a little bit about Indigenous history and culture. At least perhaps starting in Canada, because I myself am fascinated by that world and will continue to learn more. So, Scott, thank you very much for doing this. I'm sure the students will have great questions for you. I appreciate you making the time.
Thank you very much, Jay. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Thanks everyone for listening. This has been another Good Life conversation. We hope to have you at the next one.